For hundreds of years, Europe believed something so deeply that it rarely questioned it. Power lived in blood, not in intelligence, not in wisdom, not even in strength. It lived in lineage. A child could be born into authority without proving anything at all. Another could live a lifetime of skill and never come close to ruling. This was not seen as unfair. It was seen as natural, necessary, even sacred. Tonight, we're going to sit quietly with that idea. Why did Europe place such faith in bloodlines? Why did families, not individuals, rule for centuries? Why did birth matter more than ability, even when it led to war, sickness, and collapse? The answers are older than nations, older than parliaments, older than the idea that power should be earned. They come from a world where stability mattered more than justice, where continuity felt safer than change, and where the past was trusted far more than the unknown future. Imagine living in a time without clear borders, without national identities, without written laws that applied equally to everyone. In such a world, order was fragile. If one ruler fell, everything beneath them could fall as well. Fields would be abandoned. Armies would fracture. Local lords would fight. Villages would burn. Trade would stop. Hunger would follow. People learned this lesson early, and they learned it harshly. So Europe found a solution that felt steady, even comforting. Rule would pass through families, not because families were always wise, but because they were predictable. A son could be prepared from birth. A daughter could be married with intention. A dynasty could promise continuity in a dangerous world. Blood became proof. Not proof of goodness, but proof of belonging. Over time, this belief hardened. It wrapped itself in ceremony, religion, and tradition. Kings were crowned by priests. Queens were anointed with holy oil. Genealogies were recited like sacred texts. Power was no longer just inherited. It was explained. Rulers were said to be chosen by God. Their blood was said to carry divine favor. To challenge them was not only treason, it was sin. And most people accepted this. Not because they were foolish, but because alternatives were frightening. If anyone could rule, who would decide? If talent mattered, whose talent? If strength mattered, whose strength would be strongest tomorrow? Bloodlines answered these questions quietly. They didn't promise fairness. They promised order. And in a violent, uncertain world, order mattered more. But blood rule came at a cost. Families married into themselves to preserve purity. Weak heirs inherited crowns. Children ruled empires they barely understood. Wars were fought not for land, but for claims. For who had the right blood? For which branch of a family tree mattered more? Entire nations suffered because of private family failures. Yet still, the system endured. Because once blood becomes power, power works very hard to protect itself. Tonight's story is not about one king or one dynasty. It's about a way of thinking that shaped Europe for centuries, a belief that the past should rule the present, that continuity was safer than change, that power should remain familiar, even when it failed. As we move slowly through this history, notice how often fear drives decisions. Fear of chaos, fear of outsiders, fear of the unknown. Bloodlines were not only about control, they were about comfort. And when that comfort began to crack, when bloodlines could no longer hide their flaws, Europe began to change. But that change took a very long time. If this is your first time here, welcome to Archive of Rest, a place where history unfolds slowly, without urgency. If you'd like to rest with stories like this again, you're always welcome to stay. Now, Let's go back further, before kingdoms, before nations, before borders made sense, to a Europe where power was not written in law, but remembered in families, and where blood was the closest thing to permanence the world had ever known. To understand why bloodlines ruled Europe, we first have to step into a world that feels unfamiliar to us now, a world without nations. There was no such thing as France in the modern sense, no unified Germany, no fixed idea of citizenship, passports, or national loyalty. People did not belong to countries. They belonged to places, to lords, and most of all, to relationships. Power was personal. If you lived in a village, your life was shaped by who owned the land beneath your feet. That land belonged to a lord. That lord owed loyalty to another lord, and that chain might rise, slowly and unevenly, toward a king, though even that title meant something very different than it does today. Authority was not abstract. It was human. You obeyed someone because you knew them, feared them, or depended on them. Laws were local. Justice was inconsistent. Protection came from proximity, not principle. In such a world, stability was fragile. There were no standing national armies in the modern sense. Soldiers were raised through obligation. A lord would call upon his vassals. Those vassals would call upon theirs. Loyalty moved downward like water through stone, and it could dry up just as easily. If a powerful lord died without a clear successor, uncertainty followed. Promises unraveled. Oaths were questioned. Rivals appeared. Violence often filled the silence left behind. People understood this deeply. They had lived through it. So, when Europe began to organize power, it did so around the one thing that felt continuous: family. Land passed from father to son. Titles passed through blood. Authority followed lineage not because it was ideal, but because it was familiar. Written law was weak. Memory was strong. Everyone knew who belonged to which family, who had ruled before, who had the strongest claim. Even illiterate peasants could recite local genealogies, not out of admiration, but necessity. Knowing who ruled mattered. It could mean safety or survival. In this world, power was not owned. It was inherited, and inheritance required clarity. Bloodlines provided that clarity. They told people who came next. They reduced uncertainty. They gave violence a shape, and often delayed it. Because even when people disagreed, they often agreed on one thing. This family had ruled before. That mattered more than competence, more than vision, more than fairness. Land was the true source of power, but land could not rule itself. It needed a recognized holder, someone whose authority felt legitimate enough to be obeyed. Blood answered that need, not because it was sacred at first, but because it was practical. A son raised within a household learned how to command that household. He watched how disputes were settled, how alliances were maintained, how force was used, and when it was withheld. He absorbed power before he ever held it. This did not guarantee wisdom, but it promised continuity, and continuity was everything. Europe's early power structures were not designed to create progress. They were designed to prevent collapse. Every decision favored stability over improvement. A predictable ruler was safer than a brilliant stranger, and strangers were dangerous. Merit, the idea that the most capable should rule, carried risk. Who judged merit? By what standard? And what happened when someone stronger appeared? In a violent world, merit could mean endless challenge, endless war. Bloodlines limited that danger. They narrowed the field. They created a closed system where claims could be argued within a family, rather than across society. This did not eliminate violence. It contained it. Succession disputes were brutal, but they followed patterns. Brothers fought brothers. Cousins fought cousins. The rest of society watched and waited, and often they accepted the outcome. Because once a victor emerged, the system stabilized again. Family continuity made memory possible. A ruling house carried history with it. Old promises, old alliances, old grudges. Other nobles understood this. They married into it, swore to it, planned around it. Power became a network of families, not institutions. You didn't trust a law. You trusted a name, and names endured. As centuries passed, these family networks thickened. Intermarriage linked distant regions. A noble house in one valley might be related by marriage to another hundreds of miles away. This mattered more than geography. Borders were vague. They shifted with inheritance. A kingdom could grow or shrink not through conquest, but through birth. A child born in the right marriage could quietly inherit land that no army ever marched across. This is why bloodlines became so central. They were not symbolic, they were functional. They organized power in a world that lacked systems. They created a sense of order without bureaucracy, continuity without paperwork, legitimacy without law. But they also locked Europe into the past. Because when authority flows through family, innovation becomes suspicious. Change feels like threat. New ideas challenge old names, and old names rarely welcome that. Bloodlines preserved memory, but they also preserved mistakes. A weak ruler could not easily be replaced. A cruel one could endure. A child could rule simply because no one else had the right blood. People suffered quietly beneath this logic, not because they believed it was just, but because they feared what might come if it broke. Rebellion meant chaos. Chaos meant hunger. So the system held, not because it was loved, but because it was known. Only later would Europe begin to imagine something else, something less personal, more abstract, more dangerous at first. The idea that power might belong to offices, not families, to systems, not blood. But for now, bloodlines made sense. In a world without nations, without stable laws, without shared identity, family was the closest thing to permanence Europe had. And once power settled into blood, it would take centuries to pry it loose. Because blood remembers. And for a very long time, Europe trusted memory more than possibility. Once power settled into families, Europe faced a quieter problem. How do you convince people that this arrangement is not only practical, but right? Force could win obedience for a time. Fear could hold villages in place. But fear alone was never enough to last generations. Something deeper was needed. Something that reached beyond swords and walls. That something became belief. Over centuries, blood was transformed from a method of inheritance into proof of legitimacy. Not merely who ruled, but why they should rule. Power began to speak in the language of destiny. Rulers did not simply inherit land, they inherited meaning. The idea slowly took shape that certain families were meant to rule. That authority was not chosen by humans at all, but granted by forces beyond them. God, fate, providence, the natural order of the world. This belief did not appear overnight. It grew carefully, layer by layer, until it felt ancient, unquestionable, and permanent. Religion played a central role in this transformation. In a deeply religious society, the sacred carried immense weight. Churches were among the few institutions that crossed regions. Priests and monks preserved memory. Rituals marked time. And religion offered explanations when the world felt chaotic. So power aligned itself with the sacred. Kings were crowned by religious figures. They were anointed with holy oils. They swore oaths not only to their people, but to God himself. The message was subtle but powerful. This ruler does not merely govern you. He stands between heaven and earth. Bloodlines were woven into this story. If God chose a ruler, then surely God chose the ruler's family. Their blood was no longer ordinary. It carried favor, purpose, a trace of the divine. To oppose such a ruler was no longer a political act. It was a spiritual one. This belief reshaped obedience. People did not need to love their ruler. They only needed to believe that resisting him was wrong, dangerous, even sinful. And belief, once planted, is remarkably resilient. Myths grew around royal blood. Some families claimed descent from ancient heroes. Others traced their lineage back to biblical figures or legendary founders. Genealogies were rewritten, embellished, and ritualized. Accuracy mattered less than continuity. The past was shaped to support the present. These stories were repeated in ceremonies, songs, and chronicles. Over time, they blurred into memory. What had once been propaganda became tradition. What had been invented became inherited truth. Bloodlines gained weight not because they were proven, but because they were repeated. And repetition creates reality. For ordinary people, this framework made sense. The world was dangerous and unpredictable. Harvests failed. Plagues arrived without warning. War could appear suddenly on the horizon. In such a world, believing that power was ordered, even divinely ordered, brought comfort. If a king ruled by God's will, then chaos had limits. Suffering had meaning. The world, however harsh, was not random. Bloodlines offered structure to uncertainty. They told people that someone was in charge, and that this someone belonged there. Even when rulers failed, the idea remained. A bad king did not disprove blood rule. He was explained away. He was a test, a punishment, a warning. The system protected itself. This belief also served elites. Nobles benefited deeply from blood-based legitimacy. Their own authority rested on similar claims. If kings ruled by blood, then so did they. Questioning the king meant questioning the entire structure of privilege. So nobles reinforced the myth. They married carefully. They guarded family histories. They treated lineage as currency. Blood became social proof. Who you descended from mattered more than what you did. An ancient name opened doors. A forgotten one closed them. Merit had limits. Blood did not. This created a society obsessed with ancestry. Family trees were guarded more carefully than land records. Marriages were negotiated like treaties. Children were raised not only as individuals, but as carriers of legacy. A child born into a ruling family did not belong fully to themselves. They belonged to the future. Every action reflected on the bloodline. Every failure threatened it. Every marriage risked diluting or strengthening it. This pressure shaped rulers from infancy. They were taught not simply to rule, but to represent, to embody the past, to carry the weight of those who came before. Blood, in this sense, became identity, and identity became authority. Over time, this belief hardened into doctrine. The right to rule was no longer debated, it was assumed. Challenges still occurred, but they followed the same logic. Rivals rarely argued that bloodlines didn't matter. They argued that their blood mattered more. Wars were fought over claims, over whose lineage was purer, closer, more legitimate. Even rebellion spoke the language of blood. A usurper needed a genealogy. A rebel needed an ancestral claim. Without it, they were merely a criminal. With it, they could become a king. This reveals something important. Blood rule was not simply imposed from above. It was shared. People believed it because everyone used it. It was the common grammar of power, and, like all shared beliefs, it became invisible. People stopped noticing it as a choice. It felt like reality itself. Yet beneath this certainty, cracks slowly formed. Because blood does not guarantee wisdom. A ruler could be born weak, or cruel, or indifferent. A child could inherit a crown long before understanding it. A family could decay while still claiming divine favor. These contradictions were uncomfortable. But belief systems are skilled at absorbing discomfort. Failures were explained as mysteries, as part of a larger plan, as punishment for sins unseen, and the alternative, a world where anyone might rule, still felt more frightening. Blood rule, for all its flaws, offered a clear answer to a dangerous question: who should be obeyed? It answered quietly, firmly, and without debate: the one who was born to it. As long as Europe remained fragmented, violent, and uncertain, that answer held. But blood carried another problem, one that belief alone could not erase. Blood is finite. It weakens. It repeats. It traps families inside themselves. And the more power depended on purity, the more fragile that power became. Europe would learn this slowly, painfully, and at great cost. But before bloodlines could begin to fail, they would first be sharpened, turned into tools, used not only to justify power, but to expand it. That story begins with marriage. Quiet ceremonies, private negotiations, and decisions that reshaped continents without drawing a single sword. Once blood became the proof of right, Europe discovered something quietly devastating. Blood could move, not across battlefields, not behind shields or banners, but across time. Marriage turned blood into motion. A sword could take land in a season. Marriage could take it in a generation. And what was taken through marriage was often harder to resist, because it did not look like conquest. It arrived gently, wrapped in ceremony, accompanied by blessings, feasts, and promises of peace. Royal marriage was never primarily about affection. Love was unreliable. Love disrupted plans. Love created loyalties that could not be negotiated. What mattered was inheritance. A royal marriage asked a single question, asked again and again in different forms. What does this union bring into the bloodline? Land, titles, claims, allies, future heirs who would carry more than one history in their veins. Marriage transformed blood from justification into strategy. Europe learned that it could grow without fighting, if it was willing to wait. A king no longer needed to defeat his neighbor. He needed only to marry his child wisely. The conquest would come later, through grandchildren. This way of thinking reshaped power slowly and almost invisibly. Borders stopped being lines defended by armies and became ideas embedded in family trees. A territory could change hands without a single soldier marching. A crown could pass quietly through a dowry. Marriage did not announce itself as violence, but its consequences could be just as total. A princess was no longer merely a daughter. She was a carrier of future authority. Her body became political terrain. Her children would decide who ruled lands she might never visit. Her value was measured not by desire, but by what she connected. Marriage made the future negotiable, and everyone involved understood this. Royal courts became places of calculation disguised as civility. Conversations were polite, even tender, but beneath them ran careful measurement. Age mattered. Health mattered. Fertility mattered. Family histories were examined for strength or weakness. Illnesses were whispered about. Early deaths remembered carefully. A match could shape a century, so nothing was left to chance. Children were promised before they could speak. Betrothals were arranged before faces were familiar. Lives unfolded along paths chosen by people who would never see their outcomes. This was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as responsibility, because bloodlines did not belong to individuals. They belonged to the future. Marriage solved a problem armies could not. It made domination look legitimate. A conquered people resisted foreign rule. An inherited ruler felt different. The name might change, but the logic remained familiar. A new monarch could claim ancient rights through marriage. Local elites retained status. Laws often stayed intact. Nothing appeared stolen. Marriage softened power. It disguised absorption as continuity. But marriage did not erase claims. It multiplied them. When two ruling families joined, so did their unresolved histories. Dormant rights awakened. Old grievances reemerged. A child born of such a union carried overlapping claims, some clear, others dangerously ambiguous. That child might one day inherit multiple crowns, or none. Europe became a continent governed by potential. Every birth rearranged possibility. Every death closed or opened futures. Marriage created a web so complex that no one fully controlled it. Rulers learned to think in generations. They planned not only for their reigns, but for those who would follow them. Their grandchildren mattered more than their victories. A single marriage could secure peace for decades, or ensure war for a century. Because marriage created expectations, promises of support, guarantees of succession, agreements written carefully and interpreted creatively. When those expectations failed, when an heir died young, when a marriage produced no children, when a contract was disputed, conflict followed. Wars erupted not because land was desired, but because it was believed to be owed. Blood claims were elastic. A ruler could reach backward through generations to justify invasion. A forgotten marriage could be revived as evidence. A distant ancestor could be made relevant again. And because blood had been accepted as proof of right, these arguments carried weight. Armies marched in the name of inheritance, not conquest, restoration. Marriage also narrowed power. As families married into one another repeatedly, authority concentrated into fewer hands. A small circle of houses came to rule vast regions. They shared blood, assumptions, fears, and habits. Difference disappeared. Outsiders found entry impossible. New families could gain wealth, but not legitimacy. They could buy land, but not history. Time remained the only currency that mattered, and time favored those already inside. Marriage fed this concentration. Each union reinforced the same circle. Each child narrowed possibility. Each generation made power more exclusive. At first, this looked like strength. Fewer families meant fewer rivals, but concentration carried risk. Options shrank. Matches grew closer. Cousins married cousins. Nieces married uncles. Blood folded inward. What had once been expansion turned into preservation. Marriage shifted purpose. Instead of gaining new claims, it guarded existing ones. Instead of reaching outward, it closed ranks. The goal became purity. Purity felt like safety, but purity limited resilience. Royal families became cautious to the point of anxiety. Every marriage risked dilution. Every outsider threatened legitimacy. Negotiations grew longer, matches harder to secure, pressure increased, and beneath it all lay an unspoken truth. Marriage could not guarantee outcome. A child might be born weak, or not at all. A carefully planned union might end a lineage instead of extending it. Marriage postponed uncertainty. It did not remove it. This made succession fragile. When plans failed, courts scrambled. Regents stepped in. Factions formed around different interpretations of inheritance. Marriage had expanded the web of power, but also tangled it. The more interconnected bloodlines became, the harder succession grew. No claim stood alone. This complexity made violence more likely, not less, because ambiguity invites force. Still, rulers persisted, because marriage offered something nothing else could. Time to shape the future, time to outlast rivals, time to turn patience into dominance. Kings learned to wait. A battle might fail, a marriage endured, and so marriage became the preferred weapon. Not loud, not heroic, but relentless. It reshaped Europe quietly. People beneath this system lived with consequences they never chose. They paid taxes to rulers inherited through distant unions, fought wars sparked by marriages generations old, changed allegiance because of births they never witnessed. Yet it still felt legitimate, because blood explained it. Marriage made blood portable. It allowed power to move without force, and because it moved slowly, resistance rarely gathered in time. But marriage had another cost. It stripped individuals of agency. Royal children were raised not as people, but as futures. Their bodies became bargaining chips. Their lives belonged to agreements signed long before they could understand them. Personal happiness mattered little. Duty mattered entirely. This created quiet suffering. Queens endured endless pregnancies to secure heirs. Princes were trained for roles they might never want. Lives were measured in usefulness, and when usefulness ended, so did attention. Marriage consumed individuality, and over generations, it consumed families themselves. Because when marriage serves blood alone, it stops serving life. Repeated intermarriage weakened bodies, narrowed minds, reduced adaptability. The weapon turned inward. Marriage had built empires. Now it trapped them. Europe would not recognize this immediately. It took generations of weak heirs, failed successions, and exhausted families to see the cost. Marriage had preserved power, but frozen it, and frozen things eventually crack. The strategy that once allowed bloodlines to expand without war had created a world unable to adapt. When new pressures arrived, economic change, population growth, shifting ideas, blood-bound systems struggled. Marriage could not solve everything. It could only delay reckoning. That reckoning would arrive not through love or union, but through fear. Fear of those excluded. Fear of those waiting outside the circle. Fear of outsiders who no longer accepted that birth alone should decide everything. That fear would shape the next stage of Europe's story, because the more tightly bloodlines closed themselves through marriage, the more threatening the outside world became. And eventually, the greatest danger to blood rule would not be war, or illness, or inheritance. It would be the realization that power no longer needed blood at all. As bloodlines tightened their grip on power, another force grew quietly alongside them. fear. Not the fear of invasion or famine, though those were constant, but a more specific anxiety, a fear of interruption. A fear that someone from outside the sacred circle of lineage might step in and disrupt the order that blood had built. This fear shaped Europe just as deeply as belief. Because once power is inherited, anyone who is not born into it becomes a threat. In a blood-based system, talent is dangerous. Skill invites questions. Intelligence challenges tradition. Success without ancestry suggests that blood may not be necessary at all, and that possibility frightened those who ruled. The medieval and early modern world often spoke about loyalty, honor, and duty, but beneath these words lay a simpler concern: control. Bloodlines allowed elites to predict who would rise and who would not. They narrowed ambition. They told people, quietly but firmly, how far they were allowed to go. Outsiders disrupted that clarity. An outsider might be wealthy but not noble, educated but not born right, brave in battle but descended from the wrong people. Such individuals unsettled the system, because if one outsider rose, others might follow. And if that happened, blood would lose its meaning. So Europe built barriers. Some were legal, some were cultural. Many were invisible but deeply felt. Titles were restricted, land ownership limited, offices reserved for those of proper birth. Even the church, one of the few paths theoretically open to commoners, increasingly favored those from noble families. Merit was acknowledged, but rarely rewarded with real power. A talented outsider might serve a ruler, advise him, fight for him, but ruling alongside him was another matter entirely. Power could be borrowed, but it was not shared. This exclusion was justified carefully. Outsiders were described as unstable, ambitious, disloyal, too eager, too hungry. They were said to lack the restraint that came from generations of rule. The patience learned through inheritance. The sense of responsibility passed down through blood. These were convenient arguments. They framed privilege as virtue, and they reassured elites that their dominance was not selfish, but necessary. The fear of outsiders also reinforced social distance. Ruling families lived differently, ate differently, spoke differently, married differently. These distinctions were not only displays of wealth, they were signals of separation. Bloodlines were protected not just biologically, but culturally. To blur the line between ruler and ruled was to risk collapse, and collapse was remembered vividly. Europe had seen moments when social order broke down, when ambitious men rose too quickly, when violence followed charisma, when loyalty fractured. These moments were remembered not as opportunities, but as warnings. The message was clear. Change invites chaos. Bloodlines promised continuity. Outsiders promised uncertainty. So the system closed ranks. New families struggled to enter the ruling class, even when they acquired wealth. They could buy land, but not history. They could build estates, but not legitimacy. Time, not talent, remained the true currency. This rigidity preserved order, but at a cost. It slowed adaptation. It discouraged innovation. It rewarded conformity over creativity. But for centuries, this seemed acceptable, because the alternative felt worse. Blood-based rule created a hierarchy everyone understood. Each person knew their place. Expectations were clear. Mobility was limited, but predictability was high. For many, this predictability felt safer than ambition. The fear of outsiders was not only imposed from above, it was shared below. People distrusted sudden change. They feared leaders who came from nowhere. They preferred familiar names, even when those names disappointed them. A known failure felt safer than an unknown promise. This mindset strengthened bloodlines further. It taught society to equate legitimacy with familiarity, and familiarity with ancestry. Yet this fear created contradictions. Outsiders were often needed. Rulers depended on skilled administrators, generals, and advisors who did not belong to the ruling families. These individuals kept states functioning. They collected taxes, organized armies, managed diplomacy. They knew how power worked, but they were never meant to own it. This created tension. Outsiders held influence without legitimacy. Elites held legitimacy without competence. The balance was uneasy. At times, outsiders grew too powerful. Their influence threatened the families they served. When that happened, suspicion followed. Accusations spread. Trust evaporated. Many capable individuals fell suddenly, not because they failed, but because they frightened those above them. Bloodlines could not tolerate rivals who did not share their ancestry. The fear of outsiders also shaped justice. Crimes committed by nobles were judged differently than those committed by commoners. Punishments varied not by severity, but by status. Blood softened consequences. This reinforced the idea that lineage placed some people beyond ordinary rules, and that belief fed resentment. Quiet resentment, mostly, unspoken, but enduring. Still, rebellion was rare, because blood-based systems were skilled at isolating dissent. A rebel without lineage was easy to dismiss. A traitor, a criminal, a threat to order. Only those with blood could challenge blood. And even then, the challenge had to speak the same language. This kept revolution at bay for centuries, but it also trapped Europe inside a narrow imagination of leadership. Rulers were chosen from a shrinking pool. Families intermarried. Traits repeated. Weaknesses multiplied. The system that excluded outsiders also excluded renewal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, this rigidity began to strain. As commerce expanded, cities grew. Education spread. New wealth appeared outside old families. Outsiders became harder to ignore. They funded wars, ran administrations, supplied armies. They saw how power worked and wondered why birth should decide everything. The fear of outsiders intensified. Elites tightened controls, reinforced customs, doubled down on lineage. But fear has limits. The more rigid the system became, the more fragile it grew. Bloodlines preserved order, but they also froze it. They protected society from chaos, but also from change. And when change finally came, it would not ask permission. But before that moment arrived, Europe would endure something else. A test not of outsiders, but of blood itself. Because the greatest threat to bloodline rule did not come from below. It came from within, from weak heirs, from children on thrones, from families that could no longer produce rulers capable of holding what they inherited. And when bloodlines failed, fear alone could not save them. For centuries, Europe trusted blood to hold power steady. But blood, like anything human, could fail. Not suddenly, not dramatically at first, but quietly through weakness, absence, and silence. The most dangerous moments in a blood-based system were not rebellions or invasions. They were gaps. A ruler died too young. An heir was too weak. A child inherited a crown meant for an adult. And the entire structure trembled. Because bloodlines did not guarantee strength. They only guaranteed succession. and succession without stability was perilous. Europe learned this lesson again and again. A strong king could rule for decades, enforcing order through presence alone. His authority felt natural because it was familiar. People adjusted to him. Elites aligned themselves around him. Violence, though never absent, stayed contained. But when he died, everything reset. If his heir was capable, the transition passed quietly. If not, uncertainty flooded in. A weak heir was not, simply an unfortunate ruler. He was an invitation. Rivals saw opportunity. Nobles tested boundaries. Foreign powers watched closely. Every flaw became political. Illness mattered. Temperament mattered. Age mattered. A ruler who hesitated invited challenge. One who acted impulsively invited resistance. Bloodlines could place a crown on a head, but they could not keep it there. Child kings were especially dangerous. A child could inherit authority, but not command it. He ruled in name only, surrounded by regents, advisors, and guardians who governed on his behalf. This arrangement looked orderly on parchment. In reality, it was unstable. Power fractured. Each regent claimed loyalty to the child, but pursued personal advantage. Factions formed around influence. Decisions slowed. Conflicts multiplied. The crown remained intact. The authority beneath it dissolved. Children became symbols rather than rulers, and symbols attract manipulation. Some regents ruled wisely. Others abused their position. Some genuinely protected the realm. Others stripped it quietly for personal gain. The people beneath this system felt the consequences. Taxes rose. Justice became uneven. Wars broke out over decisions no one truly owned. Blood had delivered continuity, but not leadership. And when leadership vanished, violence returned. Europe's history is filled with succession crises that began with a simple problem: no clear heir. A king died without a son. A dynasty ended in daughters. A ruler's legitimacy was questioned due to birth, marriage, or rumor. In such moments, bloodlines stopped providing clarity. Instead, they multiplied claims. Cousins emerged. Uncles asserted rights. Distant relatives traced genealogies through forgotten marriages. Everyone had blood. Everyone had a story, and each story justified force. Wars of succession were among the most destructive conflicts Europe endured. They were not ideological wars. They were family. Arguments scaled to nations. Cities burned because of disputed births. Armies marched because of contested inheritances. Entire populations suffered because bloodlines could not agree on themselves. These wars were difficult to end, because compromise felt illegitimate. If blood determined right, then only one claim could be correct. Sharing power meant diluting truth. So conflicts dragged on. Years passed. Generations grew up knowing only instability. And still, Europe clung to blood, because even when bloodlines failed, alternatives felt worse. Replacing a dynasty raised terrifying questions. Who decided when blood was no longer valid? Who chose the replacement? What stopped the next challenge? So societies endured weakness rather than risk chaos. They tolerated child kings, weak rulers, absentee monarchs. Anything was preferable to uncertainty. But tolerance had limits. Sometimes bloodlines failed catastrophically. A ruler proved not merely weak, but destructive, cruel, indifferent, detached from reality. In such cases, legitimacy eroded. People whispered, nobles hesitated, loyalty thinned. Still, removal was rare, because a blood rule had trained Europe to endure suffering rather than confront authority. Yet even this endurance could be exhausted. Occasionally, a ruler failed so completely that the illusion collapsed. Deposition followed. Execution sometimes. These moments were shocking. They shattered the myth that blood alone protected power. And because they were rare, they were deeply destabilizing. Once blood could be overthrown, nothing felt certain. But these moments planted seeds. They taught Europe that blood was not invincible, that lineage could be challenged and sometimes defeated. Still, bloodlines adapted. Failures were explained away. Blame shifted to advisors, regents, or divine punishment. The system survived by refusing to examine itself. But there was another, quieter failure unfolding at the same time: inheritance without capability. As bloodlines narrowed, rulers increasingly resembled one another, not only in appearance but in temperament. Families repeated traits. Strengths, yes, but also weaknesses: timidity, obsession, volatility, fragility. Blood preserved continuity, but it also preserved flaws. A capable ruler might be followed by an incapable son, then another, then another. The system had no correction mechanism. Merit could not intervene. Outsiders could not replace. Blood alone decided. This led to stagnation. States fell behind competitors. Armies weakened. Administrations decayed. And because rulers believed their authority was inherent, they often failed to adapt. They ruled as they had been taught, even when circumstances changed. The world shifted around them. Commerce expanded. Cities grew. New ideas spread quietly through universities and trade routes. But bloodlines resisted. They trusted inheritance over innovation, tradition over adjustment. This rigidity made failures more costly. A single incapable ruler could undo decades of careful governance. And when multiple such rulers followed one another, decline became visible. Yet the crown remained, because bloodlines were patient. They could endure decay as long as no clear alternative emerged. But bloodlines had one final vulnerability. They depended on reproduction. Children had to be born, survive, grow, rule, and sometimes that simply did not happen. Infertility ended dynasties. Stillbirths erased futures. Illness thinned family trees. Entire ruling houses vanished quietly, leaving behind empty thrones and unresolved claims. These moments were terrifying. Without blood, legitimacy collapsed. Societies scrambled to construct narratives, to identify distant relatives, to invent continuity where none remained. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they did not. And when they failed, power reverted to force. Violence replaced inheritance. The very chaos bloodlines were meant to prevent returned with intensity. These failures accumulated. They did not immediately end blood rule, but they weakened its authority. Each crisis left a scar. Each scar made belief harder to sustain. People began to notice patterns. Weak rulers followed weak rulers. Child kings ruled through others. Dynasties decayed visibly. The promise of blood began to ring hollow. Yet habit is powerful. Europe continued to rely on bloodlines not because they worked, but because abandoning them felt impossible. Blood rule had shaped every institution. Law, religion, nobility, land ownership, all were built around lineage. To dismantle bloodlines meant dismantling everything. So failure was absorbed, endured, normalized, until the cost grew too high. And then, slowly, reluctantly, Europe began to imagine alternatives. Not replacements overnight, but supplements, councils, advisors, administrators, systems that reduced reliance on a single person. These changes did not reject bloodlines. They compensated for them. But even compensation was a sign. It acknowledged that blood alone was no longer enough, that authority required support, structure, and eventually something beyond birth. But before Europe could let go of blood, it would endure one more consequence of its devotion. Because the more families relied on blood to secure power, the more tightly they held it. And the tighter they held it, the more damage they did to themselves. That damage would show itself not only in politics, but in bodies, in minds, in generations weakened by the effort to keep power pure. That story comes next. By the time Europe began to notice that bloodlines were failing, the damage was already deep. Not only in politics, but in bodies, in minds, in families that had ruled for centuries and now struggled simply to continue. The very thing meant to preserve a power had begun to consume it. Bloodlines were designed to protect legitimacy, to keep authority contained within trusted families, to prevent outsiders from disrupting the order. But protection, taken too far, becomes confinement. As ruling houses married within ever narrower circles, blood stopped flowing outward. It folded back on itself. Cousins became spouses, nieces became brides, uncles became husbands. What once had been strategic alliances turned into repetitions. Europe did not choose this path because it was ignorant. It chose it because options disappeared. As power concentrated, there were fewer acceptable matches. Only certain families were equal. Only certain blood was considered worthy. Marrying outside. The circle risked dilution. It threatened legitimacy. It introduced the unknown. So families chose familiarity. Again and again and again. At first, the consequences were subtle. A child born weaker than expected, an heir sickly in youth, a temperament unstable, erratic, withdrawn. These were explained away. God's will, bad luck, temporary weakness. Bloodlines were never blamed. But repetition does not remain quiet forever. Over generations, traits accumulated. Physical deformities, chronic illness, infertility, cognitive impairment. The ruling families of Europe began to look fragile. Not metaphorically, literally. Courts whispered. Diplomats noticed. Physicians recorded symptoms they barely understood. Still, the system persisted, because acknowledging the cause would have meant questioning the foundation of rule itself. Better to blame individuals than lineage. Better to mourn than to reform. And so Europe watched as its most powerful families slowly decayed. This decay did not always take dramatic form. Often it was expressed as absence. Heirs who died young, queens who could not conceive, kings whose reigns ended without succession. Each absence widened uncertainty. Bloodlines depended on continuity. Every break created vulnerability. As dynasties thinned, marriages grew more desperate. Matches were made not for advantage, but for survival. Any union that promised heirs became valuable. Fertility outweighed politics. Health became currency. But narrowing blood made even this uncertain. Some families produced children who could not rule. Others produced none at all. The crown remained, but the blood beneath it weakened. This fragility altered governance. Rulers became cautious, anxious, obsessed with legacy. Decisions were delayed, risks avoided, innovation resisted. When your bloodline feels endangered, preservation becomes priority, and preservation rarely encourages progress. Europe's ruling families became inward-looking, defensive, focused on survival rather than stewardship. This inward focus deepened stagnation. States fell behind competitors. Armies lagged. Administrations aged poorly. And because rulers believed their authority was inherent, they often misjudged their limits. Weakness was denied, yet it was visible. A king who could not walk unassisted. A queen whose pregnancies ended repeatedly. A ruler prone to sudden rages or long silences. These were not private matters. They shaped policy, war, succession. Bloodline decay made governance unpredictable, and unpredictability eroded trust. People began to question, quietly at first, not the system, but the outcome. Why did rulers seem so fragile? Why did power produce such weakness? The answer remained unspoken. Because speaking it threatened everything. Still, consequences accumulated. Inbreeding did not merely weaken bodies. It narrowed perspectives. Families that married only among themselves shared the same assumptions, fears, and habits. They lost contact with broader society. They ruled people they barely understood. This distance deepened resentment. Commoners noticed the contrast. They labored, adapted, survived plagues and wars, while rulers seemed increasingly detached, fragile, and ineffective. The myth of superior blood began to strain. Yet the myth endured, because bloodlines were not simply political tools. They were identity systems. To abandon them meant abandoning a worldview. So decline was endured. Even madness was tolerated. Rulers who exhibited paranoia, delusion, or emotional instability were managed rather than removed. Advisors compensated. Courts adjusted. As long as the blood remained, the crown stayed. This tolerance carried a cost. States drifted. Decisions stagnated. Power concentrated in unelected hands. The crown became symbolic, while real authority fragmented behind it. Bloodlines remained visible. Governance grew invisible. This separation was dangerous, because when power hides, accountability vanishes, and blood-based systems offered no correction. A ruler born into weakness could not be voted out, could not be replaced by competence. Blood protected failure. And the longer failure endured, the more damage accumulated. Europe's political landscape grew uneven. Some states adapted faster than others. Some rulers recognized limits and delegated wisely. Others clung to authority they could not wield. Bloodlines magnified these differences. Where blood happened to produce capable rulers, stability followed. Where it did not, decay accelerated. This randomness undermined belief. Power appeared arbitrary, and arbitrariness is difficult to justify. Still, belief persisted, because abandoning it required courage. It required admitting that centuries of rule had rested on fragile assumptions, and that admission was slow. The physical consequences of inbreeding made denial harder. Deformities became visible, infertility undeniable. Lineages ended abruptly, the illusion of permanence cracked. Bloodlines were mortal, they could die, and when they did, Europe faced chaos. Vacant thrones reopened old fears. Who should rule now? Without blood, legitimacy evaporated. Temporary solutions emerged. Councils, assemblies, elected regents. These were not democratic in the modern sense, but they represented a shift. Authority no longer flowed solely from birth. It began to flow from agreement. This shift was hesitant, uneven, resisted, but it was real. Bloodlines had pushed Europe to a limit. Their insistence on purity had weakened them. Their fear of outsiders had isolated them. Their resistance to change had left them brittle. And brittleness breaks. The consequences of inbreeding were not merely biological, they were philosophical. They forced Europe to confront a question it had avoided for centuries. If blood does not guarantee strength, if lineage does not ensure wisdom, If inheritance produces decline, then why should blood rule at all? The answer would take time. Bloodlines did not vanish overnight. They adapted, retreated, reframed themselves. They shared power reluctantly, accepted constraints, allowed systems to grow around them. This transition was slow and often painful, but it marked the beginning of an end. Not the end of kings immediately, not the end of dynasties entirely, but the end of unquestioned blood rule. Europe would not abandon lineage easily. It had shaped everything. But the consequences of devotion had become too visible to ignore. Bodies weakened, minds fractured, states stagnated. Blood had preserved power and consumed it. What followed was not revolution at first. It was adjustment, a gradual shift away from inheritance as the sole source of authority, toward administration, law, institutions, and eventually toward something more abstract. The idea that power might belong not to families, but to structures. That story unfolds next. Because once blood lost its mystique, Europe had to find something else to believe in, and belief, once broken, never returns unchanged. The end of blood rule did not arrive with a single decision. There was no moment when Europe gathered itself and declared that birth no longer mattered. Instead, bloodlines loosened their grip slowly, quietly, almost reluctantly. They faded not because they were defeated, but because they were outgrown. For centuries, lineage had carried authority almost on its own. A name could command obedience. A family history could still a crowd. But as Europe changed, blood alone began to feel insufficient. Not false, not offensive, just incomplete. The world had grown heavier. Trade expanded beyond borders that once barely existed. Cities swelled with people who owed loyalty not to lords, but to work. Money moved faster than inheritance ever could. Information traveled farther than family memory. Bloodlines had been designed for a smaller world, and the world no longer fit them. Rulers noticed first, though few admitted it openly. Managing a realm now required more than ancestry. It required coordination, records, accounting, negotiation, continuity that did not depend on a single person's health, temperament, or lifespan. So quietly, rulers began to lean on others. At first, this delegation felt harmless. Clerks kept ledgers, treasurers tracked income, secretaries recorded decisions. None of this challenged blood rule directly. The crown remained sacred. The lineage remained unquestioned. But beneath it, something new took root. Administration. Power began to move sideways instead of straight down. Authority spread into offices that could survive a ruler's illness, absence, or death. Bloodlines were still visible, but no longer sufficient. This was not revolution. It was accommodation, a way to preserve the system by softening it. Ironically, this softening weakened blood rule more than rebellion ever had, because systems began to function independently. An office remembered what a ruler forgot. A council slowed rash decisions. A written procedure replaced instinct. The ruler remained, but power no longer lived entirely inside the body. This change altered daily life. Justice became more predictable, taxes more regular, orders more consistent. People began to trust processes instead of personalities, and trust is the true currency of legitimacy. Bloodlines had once held that trust by default. Now they had to share it. Belief systems shifted alongside structure. Religion remained central, but it no longer explained everything. Education spread quietly. Literacy expanded. Ideas traveled with merchants and scholars. People encountered arguments that did not rely on ancestry. They learned to think in terms of principle, law, representation, obligation. These ideas did not immediately challenge monarchy, they challenged inevitability. Blood rule had survived because it felt unavoidable. Now, alternatives could be imagined, and once imagined, they could not be unseen. Still, bloodlines did not collapse. They adapted. They reframed themselves. Kings spoke less as divine vessels and more as guardians. Queens emphasized duty rather than destiny. Dynasties leaned into tradition, ceremony, and continuity. Bloodlines became symbols, and symbols are powerful. They reassured people who feared disorder. They provided familiarity in changing times. They softened the shock of transition. This symbolic role allowed bloodlines to survive longer than expected. People did not want abrupt change. They wanted reassurance that the past still mattered. So compromise emerged. Rulers accepted limits in exchange for survival. Assemblies gained voice. Laws constrained authority. None of this erased lineage, but it bounded it. The slow end of blood rule unfolded through agreements rather than uprisings. And because it unfolded slowly, many barely noticed it happening. But emotionally, it was difficult. Bloodlines had shaped identity for centuries. People were not simply subjects. They were members of a historical chain. Their lives felt connected to something older than themselves. Letting go of blood rule felt like losing memory. It felt like standing without ancestry. This fear delayed change more than force ever could. Even those who criticized weak rulers often defended the system itself. Because blood rule felt human, it felt familiar. Systems felt cold, impersonal. People feared that removing blood from power would remove meaning from life itself. So bloodlines lingered. They remained as figureheads, as anchors, as symbols of continuity. This coexistence lasted generations. Institutions governed quietly. Bloodlines reassured publicly. And for a time, this balance worked. But balance requires honesty. And bloodlines were no longer honest representations of power. They claimed authority they no longer exercised. This gap became visible. When rulers resisted reforms, institutions pushed back. When blood demanded obedience without competence, legitimacy eroded. The crown still shone, but its weight felt lighter. The final weakening of blood rule came not from ideology, but from exhaustion. Repeated crises exposed the system's limits. Wars grew too complex for personal rule, economies too intricate, populations too large. Blood could not manage a scale. Institutions could. And once institutions proved reliable, dependence shifted. Not suddenly, but decisively. Bloodlines remained, but they were no longer necessary. That realization changed everything. Because once power is no longer necessary, it becomes optional. And optional authority eventually becomes symbolic. By the time blood rule was openly questioned, it had already lost its foundation. What remained was tradition, ceremony, memory, pageantry. Bloodlines transitioned from engines of governance to reminders of history. And Europe adjusted. Slowly, unevenly, sometimes violently. But adjust it did. The belief that power lived only in blood faded. Not because it was disproven, but because it became insufficient. Systems replaced certainty. Institutions replaced inheritance. Law replaced lineage. And yet, blood never disappeared entirely. Its shadow remained. People still cared about ancestry, still respected old names, still felt drawn to continuity, because blood speaks to something deep in the human mind. It promises belonging. It promises meaning across time. It promises that the past has not vanished. Understanding this helps us see history clearly. Blood rule was not stupidity. It was an answer to fear, fragmentation, and uncertainty. And when that answer failed, humanity did not abandon it immediately. It hesitated. Because letting go of familiar order is one of the hardest things people ever do. The slow end of blood rule was not a rejection of the past. It was a negotiation with it. And that negotiation reshaped Europe. Power became something that could be learned, managed, transferred without collapse. The world became less fragile. Not perfect, but less dependent on the accidents of birth. And that, perhaps, was the quietest transformation of all. For a very long time, Europe trusted blood to carry power safely through time. Not because blood was always strong, not because rulers were always wise, but because blood felt familiar. It felt continuous. In a world shaped by uncertainty, people reached for whatever promised stability. And for centuries, that promise lived in family lines, in names repeated across generations, in faces that resembled portraits hanging in stone halls. Bloodlines were never perfect. They were never fair. But they were predictable. And predictability in a fragile world felt like safety. Looking back, it's easy to see the cost. Wars fought over inheritance. Entire populations bound to the failures of a single family. Bodies weakened by the effort to remain pure. Minds burdened by expectations they never chose. But history is rarely built on intention alone. Blood rule did not emerge because Europe admired cruelty or exclusion. It emerged because it solved a problem, the problem of how to keep order when systems were weak and trust was personal. Families remembered when institutions could not. Lineage replaced law, birth replaced bureaucracy. And for a time, it worked. But nothing built to solve yesterday's problem survives unchanged forever. As Europe grew more connected, more complex, more crowded, blood began to feel too small to hold everything together. The world outpaced inheritance. Gradually, almost reluctantly, power learned to live outside the body. It moved into documents, into offices, into procedures and systems that could survive the death of a single person. This transition was not clean, it was not peaceful, and it was never complete all at once. Bloodlines did not vanish. They softened. They stepped back from absolute authority and became symbols, reminders of continuity rather than engines of control. And even now, long after crowns lost their power, the pull of blood remains. People still ask where leaders come from. Still value legacy. Still believe that something important travels through families, because the idea of blood carries comfort. It suggests that the past matters, that history is not broken into pieces, that something endures. This belief is older than Europe, older than kings. It lives wherever humans fear uncertainty. Bloodlines ruled not because they were inevitable, but because they felt meaningful. They gave people a story they could follow, a line from yesterday to tomorrow. And when that story failed, it did not disappear. It changed shape. Today, power often hides behind systems rather than names, behind institutions rather than faces. But the same questions remain. Who should rule? Why them? What makes authority legitimate? We no longer answer with blood alone, but we still search for reassurance. History shows us that power always wants to appear natural, inevitable, earned by something deeper than chance. Blood once filled that role, and understanding that helps us see the past not as foolish, but as human. Europe's centuries of blood rule were not a mistake in isolation. They were a response to fear, fragmentation, and the longing for continuity. And when blood could no longer carry that burden, something else had to. This slow letting go shaped the modern world, not through sudden awakening, but through exhaustion. Bloodlines did not fall because they were challenged. They fell because they could no longer hold everything they had been given, and when they loosened their grip, space opened. For systems, for law, for authority that could survive beyond a single family. That space was imperfect, often cold, sometimes impersonal, but it was more resilient, and resilience in the end mattered more than tradition. As you rest now, let this history settle gently. It is not a story of villains or heroes. It is a story of humans choosing familiarity over risk, until familiarity itself became the risk. And then, slowly, learning to choose something else. If you'd like to rest with more quiet history, you're already in the right place. Here, the past doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It simply waits to be remembered. And for now, that's enough.